You would think that a memory keeper would have learned not to forget, but the memories the memory keepers keep are difficult and filled with pain. So there is a lot of forgetting. Forgetting for a memory keeper becomes like the covering of a wound, or the drinking of water in dry times, or the shade of a solitary tree sought in the desert. These are things that forgetting becomes to a memory keeper. So there is a lot of forgetting. Later, of course, there would be news, and news could always be shared. Like the pollen of grasses shared through the breath of the wind, or water delivered to the site of the fire in buckets. But at this time, the events had not yet become news, and so the fire burned, and the grasses grew fallow. In place of news, the memories were fragmented, askew, torn, broken pieces of words, torn pieces of paper, voices, whisperings on the wind, something prior to being carried, the dream of an event or presentiment, a tearing, a thing stuck in the throat, a sound in a language not quite yet understood or known. So one would be startled in sleep, and there was a crying out, and one wanted to cry out, and yet in the crying out, one was also aware that there would be consequences for the crying out, and so one held the crying out within, and the crying out became a kind of language. And this too one was punished for. And yet, inside this, before the events had become news, one felt that another had a story, and this story, it was a terrible story and couldn't be contained by language or by those that one would want to communicate the story to, couldn't be held in consciousness, couldn't be narrated in language understandable, because memory was torn into and from itself, because in the telling it hadn't yet become news. There was no wind to carry the words. There was no bucket to carry the water. And so the fire raged, and the grasses withered and died. And later it would become a story. It would become a story of a child abducted, taken from her parents. It would become a story too horrible to tell. And one could almost understand why, in the beginning, before it became news, it was only that scream and that startle of awakening, that language that couldn't be uttered because there were consequences for uttering that language. Why, even perhaps, that it became a story told in stone, a story told with hands lifting stone, broken hands, broken fingers, and the blood left on the stones, because there was no wind and there were no buckets, because the story had not yet become news, because the story was beyond news, because the story in the news couldn't tell the story, couldn't tell the depths of the story, couldn't tell the story, couldn't tell the depths of the story, couldn't speak the words that were inside the startle, inside the scream, inside the memory of something broken and torn and unable to bear the weight of its own story. But the wind did come, and the buckets were filled with water, and the startle inside the dream, and the scream, and the language that wasn't quite language became news, and once it had become news, it could be shared, and advice could be given across the paths of different types of news, different types of messages from different types of messengers, and the messengers in between could receive messages from the messenger above, and the messengers between could share messages with those who had no messages, or those who waited for messengers, or those who waited upon the meaning of messages, or those who ignored messages, or those who erased messages, or those who denied messages. And all of these messages could be made because there was water in the bucket, because the wind blew, because the story had become news. And when the story had become news, the messengers were sent with messages from above. And because the story was too terrible, and because a sacred one had been killed, that one was to honor the sacred one was to remember. The consequence of such a terrible thing was to remember, to recall in the depths of one's spirit, to remember in this way, to remember as if this was yours, as if the murdered child were your child, as if you had been the murdered child. This was the consequence of the event, because it was you, had been you, it will be you, it is always you. And there never was a messenger who was a bucket or who was wind, and so the messengers would always know. Memories the memory keepers keep are difficult and filled with pain. So there is a lot of forgetting. Forgetting for a memory keeper becomes like the covering of a wound. Or the drinking of water in dry times, or the shade of a solitary tree sought in the desert. These are things that forgetting becomes to a memory keeper. So there is a lot of forgetting.